Email. What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
My guest today is James Williams, the Vice President of Olympic Assets and Marketing for the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. Previously, James led the execution of the Olympic torch relay for the Coca-Cola Company during the London 2012 Olympics. After delivering Coca-Cola's most successful torch relay in 2012, he was posted to Coke Brazil to lead the marketing and sponsorship for the Rio 2016 Games, where he created one of the most talked about and integrated activations ever for the Games. He has continued his career with the Coca-Cola Company in the Olympics with his move to Tokyo, Japan in 2017. Before the postponement of the Tokyo 2020 Games, James created Coca-Cola's first ever portfolio strategy and execution for a sporting asset, which has been adopted across many global markets. Not only has he driven innovative thinking, but the Tokyo Games were set to drive one of the most effective business returns for Coca-Cola Japan. He is now leading the team in what will be a different but just as impactful Games in 2021. James, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Good morning or good evening for you guys.
Appreciate you taking the time. I know you're really busy working on the Tokyo 2021 Olympic Games. So I thought we could start off with just kind of a brief background of where you came from. Obviously, you've got a British accent. So where'd you grow up? When'd you come to Coke? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was originally from the UK, born and bred in the south of the UK, near a place called Brighton, near London. Studied obviously marketing as I went through, and then as I finished university, joined many marketing agencies based in London, working on various different industries and events and things like that, across multiple different, brands and clients. In 2006, I was then asked to join Coca-Cola. Previous to that, they had been a client of mine, and I'd worked on a lot of their key sponsorship deals and brands activations before that. And so, in 2006, joined Coca-Cola in the UK and working on their marketing team, looking after various different things. Started on kind of football with the brand team, moved into the kind of what we call the brand experience team, and worked across a portfolio of different brands, working on different levels of whether it was promotions, advertising, or events and things like that. And then in 2010, I was asked and appointed to be the torch relay director for the 2012 Games, which was a huge job back then, and one that was quite scary at the time. I remember thinking, wow, it's going to be a lot of work. So did that until the end of 2012 successfully. Obviously must have done something right, because then they asked me to move to Brazil and head up the marketing and sponsorship of the Games for 2016, which was great. And then after that, I was, again, obviously didn't get that one wrong either. And then they asked me to now move over to Tokyo, where I've been for the last 3.5 years, looking after the Tokyo 2020 Games, which is now the Tokyo 2020 +1 Games. So that's where I am so far.
So this is your third event between FIFA World Cup and Olympics.
Yes.
And so, full disclosure for anybody listening in, football is not American football. Football is, of course, what us unwashed in the U.S. call soccer. It's just to make sure we're clear on that.
Yes. FIFA World Cups, football.
Yes. So what is the current title now that you have with the Tokyo 2020 +1?
So my current title is Vice President of Marketing and Assets for the Tokyo Games, which will actually will evolve in January 1, when I'll become the GM of the Tokyo 2020 +1 Games. So.
All right. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So the reason that I had wanted you to be on the podcast is, obviously I've known you for a long time, since the London Games, and then of course in Brazil as well. And I just think your story is fascinating. So I wanted to kind of bring you on to have you share with all the listeners exactly what it is that goes on in these big events, but also more really about how do you work in a global environment? Because clearly, obviously you came from the UK, so the 2012 games in London was a natural, but then of course you spent some time in Brazil and now in Japan. So we're going to get some questions a little bit later on, but what are some of the challenges that you found in working in these large global events?
Yeah, I think, first off, I think it's a great opportunity to actually be able to work on these events. I mean, they are the pinnacle of events to a point. It's massive, it's global on such a big stage, and takes years and years to kind of plan and organize. But I think there's so many different levels to that as a question. I think you've got the external side of it, which is where you have the politics, you have the stakeholder environment, you have the just general local environment in terms of the cultural environment, but also the difference in the kind of skill base within organizing events. Some cultures and markets are a lot better and much more advanced than others. So I think within that as well. And then when you get more of internally for us, I mean, as I say, the stakeholder engagement, it's one of the things that Coke is very good at. And one of the things that makes us successful in these events is how we made it touch every different part of our business. And we talk very much about legacy. So I think it's really trying to find out what legacy is for that event, both internally and externally, and actually making sure that you make a difference for the future. So for me, I think there's multiple challenges in trying to deliver these events. And I think this gets harder and harder as we go, because I think sometimes the political environment starts to impact it quite majorly. The environmental impacts of these sporting events is also starting to play. So we've got to play to all those elements, whilst ultimately for Coke, we're trying to drive business and try and drive return on investment, which again can become harder and harder.
Sure. Now, the first event you mentioned working on was the Olympic torch relay. And obviously that wasn't a challenge from a cultural perspective because that was where you grew up. But for those of us who don't know, an Olympic torch relay is a massive event. It takes a long time, lots of stops. Can you just kind of summarize it for those who don't know what the OTR is, how many stops it is, how long it takes, et cetera? Because it's a massively big logistical issue.
Yeah. So I guess I'll use the 2012 torch relay as an example. So the actual event's a 70-day event, and on each day you have about an average of 100 to 120 torch bearers running on average about I think it's a couple of thousand kilometers. And what we'll do is each day we'll start in the morning, we'll run all day handing the flame from torchbearer to torchbearer, we'll stop for lunch, then we carry on again, going through different beautiful locations, big cities, all this kind of stuff, with the streets lined with thousands of people cheering along. And then at the end of the day, we put on an event for everyone called a city celebration. And these on average are about 10,000 people. So it's a stage show with musicians, with artists, all this kind of stuff. So it's quite significant. You do that every day for 70 days. I think in London, we didn't have a day off. So it was just constant all the way through. I had a team of 70 on the road in total with the organizing committee and other sponsors. It's up to about 300 to 400 people, all moving along, hotels, food, everything, all done. And we start planning that about 2 years out, and gathering our torchbearers about a year out, to really highlight the great stories that they do and bring and the difference they make in their communities. So
and then logistically, in addition to that, there's also like sampling that's taking place, and you've got to, sample the product and collect the rubbish. I mean, there's a lot of logistics, not just, so it's part of the OTR, the Olympic Torch Relay, but it's also on top of that.
Yeah, because then you've got the second layer, which is the Coke layer, which is obviously, as you say, sampling. So, recycling everything that we do, making sure that the perfect serve of products that you're handing out either on the road with the truck. So as the truck walks along and you're bringing the happiness on the streets, that you're handing out ice cold Cokes at the perfect temperature. In London, we did Coke and Coke Zero. And then you've got sponsor stops along the route, and then in evening celebrations as well. And again, you're handing out different flags and things like this along the route, which you have to stop at certain key points and have them all reloaded. It's quite, and then you get to the stage show, you've got interviews with torchbearers, you've got musicians playing their bit, and then the flame arrives, and then it all ends, everyone goes off to bed, and then we get up and do it again at about 5 o'clock the next morning. So
69 more times.
Exactly. It's great fun. Not so much in the UK, but it was raining most of it. And the first 2 weeks were sunny and the last 2 weeks were sunny. The rest of it was just raining, which I'm sure most of your people will remember. The UK is good at rain.
It is very good at rain. Yes, it is. Yeah. I have to admit. So just thinking about some of the global challenges now when you start to move into different cultures, right? After London, you went to Brazil and now in Japan. I was wondering, thinking about Brazil, because I really liked my time there as well, working on the projects in both the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics. Is it still possible to get projects done in different cultures, like what we call a mañana culture of later, tomorrow? Did you find that to be an issue?
I guess essentially, did I find it an issue? I suppose it takes a while to get accustomed to the way they do stuff. And actually, even saying this, you said that in London, was it a challenge for me? And I never forget, and there's two guys, and they're both American, and they came over and helped me, and you know them both well, Josh and Manning. And I remember when they first came over and they were like, hey, we're going to help you do this. And at the time, I was being very British, going, well, I don't need your help. I know how to do this. These guys have done, they're so good at it. They've lived and eaten and breathed it for so long that actually me pushing back on them for 3 months, I always said was a waste of time, because actually I should have just said, hey guys, come and help me. They came and worked on the team. They were brilliant. They led to the success and part of the success of the team. So I think it's also about just welcoming that input from so many other places, which I think is so important. It was a big learning for me in 2012. And then going to Brazil, yes, that took me a series of 3 to 6 months for me to really understand what was going on. And some of the basic things, and time was the basic one for me, is I actually ended up having to research time, because it means something in Latin America. It means something different to Latin America than it does to probably the rest of the world. So time for them is all about relationship. So you start a meeting, you discuss, you get to know each other, you feel for each other, and it's great. Then you have the meeting, you have the discussion, and this goes on until you finish that discussion. The fact that you started at 9 o'clock and the meeting's booked until 10 o'clock is irrelevant. You will continue that conversation until you have finished it, which if you have back-to-back meetings just doesn't work. So it took me a long time to really understand that. I was, when I first arrived, sat in meeting rooms waiting for inductions from people who never arrived, or at least not for the first 30 minutes. And I would call them up and say, hey, you okay? Is everything all right? Why are you late? And they were like, yeah, we're coming. Don't worry about it. And so that for me was a massive cultural shift. But in answer to your question, yes, you can put them on. They just do them in a very different way.
I remember one of the things that you and I talked about even while I was there was you'd go to lunch. And of course, the takeaway culture doesn't exist in Brazil, right? Everything is consumed there. So you'd go to lunch and it'd be this really long lunch. And on the way back from lunch, you'd stop for a coffee, which was also another 20, 30 minutes of conversation. It's like, wait, we just got up from the lunch table. How are we stopping already for a coffee? So those are challenges, obviously. And then from a business perspective, which is something that's unique to us in the Western world, there, the takeaway concept doesn't really exist. So like in everywhere else, we have vending machines, not so much, right? In Brazil, and their coffee is meant to be consumed there at the bar or at the coffee place. So those are all challenges. I know you and I talked about. This idea of working through lunch also was not something that was normal. So you pick up from Brazil, which is one very different way of doing things. Then you go to Tokyo, which probably couldn't be more different. What was that like, transitioning from the mañana culture to something that very structured, they want it done a certain way? What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this many times just in a planning point of view, is trying to do planning in Brazil. In fact, I think the word for planning was a very relatively new word that they created when the FIFA World Cup and the Olympic Games came, because trying to get people to plan just didn't work. But incredibly, it all came together in Brazil at the last minute. And it was possibly the most nerve-wracking kind of event experience I've had, because you'd be standing there a couple of weeks in advance and things weren't finished and ready. But at the last minute, it all comes together and you're like, wow, how did you manage to do that? You had to have a lot of faith in it. Then you spin to Japan, where the planning, and when we did planning here, I remember the challenges we had with that, is that it was over planned. Like, it was so detailed, it was so meticulous, and everyone had to have pre-planned before they could go into a planning meeting. If they couldn't prepare for the planning meeting, it was a real struggle for them. So I think it was definitely, again, it was a learning culture. I think what happens is, over time, as you get older, you become a little bit better at it. In terms of, you understand it more, you see it coming, you've got to listen to certain cultural elements and others. But yeah, it was a real shift here. And especially now when we talk about the change. So change is not something that happens easily in Japan. Japan is consistent in everything that they do. And changing things from the way it's been done for years and years and years is a long and hard process if you want to change something, which is the complete opposite to Brazil. If you want to come up with a new creative way of doing something, great, they'll listen and they'll change it. Whereas here, you know, even when they dated back and they were talking about pre-Olympics, they were like, well, we did the torch relay in 1964 and 72 and 98. And well, we did it this way. And it's like, yep, things have moved on a little bit now. So how about we do it a different way? So that was definitely an eye-opener and a struggle. And I'll be honest, still is today.
You know, my colleague, David Hallman, he lived in Mexico for several years when he was in the textile industry. And the way he describes the mañana thing is, he was working with his colleague and the guy said, mañana, he'll do it, you know, mañana. And so David thought literally that meant tomorrow. And the next day it still wasn't done. And the guy goes, yeah, mañana. And so finally somebody had to explain to him, mañana doesn't mean tomorrow. It just means not today. So, you know, and then you go to Tokyo and I saw the same thing. If you didn't give them pre-work, they were not happy. They wanted to have the planning done before you actually had the planning session. So two very different cultures, clearly. So, do you find language to be a barrier?
Yeah, I think to a certain point, yes. In Japan, we have a lot more translators. In Brazil, it was easier to learn the language, I think, because it is still the Latin kind of, it's the same alphabet, Roman alphabet and things like that. So it was easier, and I had different, I learned different languages. So I spoke a bit of French and a bit of German. So it's a lot easier to come over the language in that way. But then in Japan, it has been a struggle, and I've really learned the difference between translators and interpreters. People that interpret and what you're saying and put it into the Japanese form of understanding. That's been a real challenge here, I think, and especially with a lot of people who don't speak English. So English was never really, it's only taught from a textbook. So reading and writing English in Japan is taught, but to speak it is never really taught. So no one really wants to speak to you. So that has been a challenge, but you know what? You find your way through it. And sometimes that's the best way, is you make some of the best friendships and the best partnerships when you have to work twice as hard as something to really understand what you're both doing. And you have to be really clear about what you're talking about, and get to the finite point so there's no lost in translation, which I have to say, when I watched the movie a few years, when I came back to Japan, I watched it again and I was like, oh yes, now I know exactly what that movie's all about. So yeah.
Now, when you get to a country, do you just get the language through immersion, or do you take classes? Do you have tutors? I mean, how does that work for you?
So we normally have a number of hours. So I think here I spent the best part of 150 hours trying to learn Japanese. And it gets you to a basic level, very basic level. So I can do the things, I can function as a person in Japan, e.g. I can go to a restaurant, I can go to a supermarket, I can just about, with a bit of help with Google Translate, you can get around and survive. Business is more of a challenge because there's different levels within it. So there's business Japanese, there's casual Japanese, there's very much different levels that you have to work against. So as much as I've tried, it will be one of the things that even with an extra year, I won't have mastered Japanese in the slightest. And in fact, I'm very grateful for my team who do speak very good English. So I'm lucky in that respect.
Is that how you manage to handle the local nuances each place you go? Is that your team helps you stay out of trouble?
Yeah, I think that's always the best way. You've got to find confidence and people that are actually, you can create a partnership or a relationship, but they're going to tell you, hey, that's out of, no, that's not going to work. Again, in Brazil, I remember trying to set up an 8:30 meeting in the morning. Someone told me that was in the UK, if you offer breakfast, that's going to be fine. So I offered breakfast, and one of the guys politely came up to me. He was from Colombia, and he came up, he goes, just so you know, no one's going to come to your meeting at 8:30 because no one comes to meetings at 8:30 in the morning. And I was like, okay, great, thanks. And then again, same in Japan, like people will come up and say, no, that's not going to work. You're trying to force something within the culture that's not going to work. So you need these people to call it out and say, yeah, sorry, you need to rethink that, or how you're approaching it, which is, I'm very fortunate because we have a lot of that, and Coke's very good at supporting us in that kind of world.
Well, I know when I got there, two of the things you told me, which by the way, I've included these two little comments in my book, but one was, that's going to be difficult. What does that actually mean when they say that's going to be difficult?
Yeah. So so you get this kind of short, musakashine, and that is essentially that means there is no way in hell that is going to happen. It's the polite way of saying, seriously, no, not in your lifetime is that going to happen. And that's when you have to read between the lines, I think.
Yeah. So I think the literal translation is that would be difficult, but it means, like you said, it's not going to happen. And the other one you mentioned to me or warned me about that was helpful was hi, which they're nodding their head while they're saying it to you. And you're thinking that means they agree, but that's not what it means.
No, they are just acknowledging there is noise coming out of your mouth. And that is definitely, I think, when I first started, we'd give these great presentations and everything like this, and then I would ask for questions. And this was a big learning for me. I'd ask for questions and there would just be this deathly silence. I've definitely, over the last 3.5 years, learned to deal with awkward silences. Because essentially what I understood it to mean was actually they were digesting what I had said. They were thinking what it meant to them. So they were applying it to their world, and then we're coming up with questions. So I would literally, when I asked, have you got any questions? I would pick up my phone and start looking at my emails, because it was going to take 5 to 10 minutes for me to get a question. I now just say, okay, we're going to have another session with questions in a couple of days' time, so come back to me with questions in a couple of days, and it's a bit better. So learn from that one.
You're back to the pre-planning before you can plan, right? So
exactly, pre-plan your questions. So let me send you the pre-read, because you always have to send a pre-read, and then you have to ask for questions in advance as well. It's all good.
I was in Brazil, in Czech Republic, teaching a class once, and I got to lunch on the first day, and I said, how are we doing? And I was greeted by dead silence. And then I said, okay, you guys all right? And I was greeted by dead silence. And then I said, does anybody understand anything that I'm saying? Dead silence. And finally, a guy said on the front row, perhaps you could speak a little slower. So I know that the translators who I've become decent friends with in Japan, they're always telling me to slow down. Yeah. So that's another challenge, obviously.
If it makes you feel any better, they still do that to me sometimes. And this noise in your ear, it's like, James, slow down. You're like, oh yeah, sorry, I forget. You're in my ear.
So obviously there are challenges, but there also have to be some benefits of living in a foreign country, because I think one of the advantages that you have, when I was in the Navy, I got to go to different places, but I was only there for a few days at a time, whereas, you actually get to be immersed for years at a time. So, what are some of the benefits that you've seen in living in foreign countries like that?
I think it definitely, having kind of use your kind of forces analogy, having boots on the ground really does help us as a business execute what's going on. We have a global team, obviously, who come in at certain points, in and out, but there's so much that goes on locally that you just don't get part of by flying in and flying out or having calls and things like this. You've got to be there, and it's about building those relationships, and especially in these events. Anything can go. And let's face it, if you looked at even at London, whether it was Rio, whether it was whether it'll be next year or even the current situation, there's times when your back's against the wall and you've got to be able to know who you can pick the phone up to and go, hey, I need a straight answer on this. What's going to happen? Oh, is this going to happen? Is that going to happen? And I think that allows, by being here for a couple of years, on top of obviously really getting to know the team, the cultural understanding and all that, you build those partnerships and relationships with people that you can trust. And in any big global event, not everything goes perfectly. I hate to tell you this. But it doesn't matter how well we plan and you teach us how to plan, there's always stuff that we can't plan for. So yeah, I think having that is great. And obviously from a personal point of view, it's fantastic to live in a different culture. I mean, the food you get to see, amazing. I mean, all the countries, I've been fortunate, all the countries I've lived in have been fantastic, amazing places, beautiful scenery, amazing people, this kind of stuff, fantastic culture, very different. But so from that side, that's great. But I think just from an event point of view, it makes so much difference to our opportunity to execute. And I think we see this from other sponsors as well. There are some that will have people here, there are some that won't. And I think it depends on how much you step in and you lean into the games. So how much do we want to support the organizing committee and the IOC? And we become quite a key partner with the IOC as well, because we're good intel for them on the ground as well. So I think it makes a big difference to the teams and also the success of the games, I think.
And I think that Amber has told me, obviously, that the organizing committees will often tell us that Coca-Cola is the best sponsor they have because we're the most prepared. You're ready. You've done the planning, and they know you're going to do a good job, which is always a nice thing to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the planning is down to you. So a lot of that is how we invite them to our sessions and they sit and they learn, and to a point they start to copy us, which is good. If it makes to a better event, that's what you want. You want everyone to come together and have a successful event. A games for me is success for everyone, not just success for Coca-Cola. And I think there are so many brands, sponsors, different areas this is new to them. And at that point, and it's crazy, going through one of these global events puts people through their paces. So you need support, a network of people around you. I have one here with all the tops and some of the local sponsors. We support the local sponsors and things like the torch relay planning, because there's 4 of us this time and 3 of them have never done it before. And you need someone that's going to go, hey, why don't we sit down and tell you roughly how you want to do this? I remember here in Japan, one of the local sponsors, brilliantly, you would laugh at this, before they'd started the nomination campaign, and for those of you that are listening, that's normally done a year before the relay. So that's where we go and recruit all the torchbearers and everything like that. That's your first most important thing. You need people to carry the torch. Without that, you kind of don't have any torchbearers. But the first thing they'd done is design and build their truck, which is what you need when you go on the road. So 2 years ahead, they'd designed their truck, but hadn't designed their torchbearer nomination program. So again, us sitting down and kind of explaining those things to them, they found it super helpful.
I think the same thing happens for the local organizing committee, because that's new to them as well, right? Not everybody moves from project to project like you do or some of the others. And you have, like you said, you've got the worldwide sports team coming in as they need to from Atlanta. And so you have that you have that transition of knowledge. Again, you have people like us who've done a lot of these games, like the ones you mentioned there earlier, helping you in the OTR as well. But the local organizing committees, usually they're new to this as well. So they need your guidance and your help to know what they need, what they don't know.
Yeah, and they appreciate it. Even when we think about Pyeongchang, whether we talk, even in Sochi, Vancouver, all of the different torch relays, and I've been to all of them now. And then also when we look ahead, I mean, we're already starting to help with Beijing. We're already starting to have conversations with Paris. All of those things help to get people into the right mindset as to what's coming. Preparation is going to help people be better at what they do. So I think it's such an important part of what we do.
Now, these are obviously large global events that you're talking about working on. And I know that from my perspective, I'm usually showing up about 2 years in advance to help with the planning. But when I get there, you guys are already in place. So How early is your team starting to form for these large events like the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup?
So I think normally we start to look at it, and it depends. The Olympics is normally slightly longer because it's slightly more complex. But the FIFA World Cup, and both of them, it's about 3 to 4 years out. That's when we'll start getting teams together on the ground. We'll start putting the thinking together, and that's really what helps us build the things like the legacies. So essentially, ultimately, this starts with what do we need to do as a business? What are the objectives that we're trying to drive? And how is this event going to help us deliver that? So what's it going to deliver for Coca-Cola? And it's really about putting that first, understanding what that is. And then you can start to plan everything around that, because without an objective or a direction, we'd be lost. And unfortunately, you see a lot of the sponsors that we work with, and when I sit down with them and maybe it's 2 years out, they'll say, oh yeah, look, we bought the torch relay. And I'm like, great, why did you buy it? What was the objective? And they said, no, we didn't have one. And then you're going to be into a place of like, okay, so what are you trying to get out of it? And I think that's the bit where we try and help a lot of them to go, hey, what are you trying to achieve? And that's also the same with the committee, understanding what the committee is trying to achieve. It sounds like pretty basic, but that kind of win-win environment is where you understand what you're all trying to achieve. You can still achieve your own individual elements, but actually you've got to find the win-wins in the middle, because that's what will make it more powerful, more strong. And I always thought, definitely for the relay in London, that was one of a big piece with us and the committee and Lloyd's and Samsung, is that we really, to a point, came together and really made a difference within the country. That's when it becomes really powerful, when you see it work.
It's time to take a break. Coming up in part 2 of my conversation with James Williams, Vice President of Olympic Assets and Marketing for the Tokyo 2020+1 Olympic Games, we discuss the importance of face-to-face conversation in cross-cultural environments.
You've got to better understand where someone's coming from. The more you can understand where someone's coming from, the better the output of what you're trying to do, because it's not just about you, it's about really understanding both sides of where the people are coming from.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.